Hi guys. So our presentation is on the effects of COVID-19 on labor markets. We're focusing on the tech startup industry. So our group is group number 3, and it consists of Victoria McAlister, Jeremy Kerzner, Mark Ruoff, and Aswathy Cinu.
Tech startups pre-COVID. Innovation of new technologies always an enticing investment opportunity for venture capitalists. BLS data for business establishment age showed that by March 2019, there were 20,616 companies within the information sector that were less than a year old. Tech startups focus on creating a product that will bring value to their consumers. Some of last year's emerging startups dealt with issues ranging from cybersecurity to banking overdraft fees. The Bloomberg Startup Index, a barometer that regularly measures market health, states that the performance of tech startups were surging in the first half of the decade, and in 2018, they were almost ahead of most publicly traded companies, but that momentum was broken as the pandemic set in.
According to CompTIA, over the last decade, there has been about a 2.3 million job growth in the tech employment industry. On the right, you can see the graph given by CompTIA, which shows the net tech employment decade recap. So from 2010 to 2019, you can see that there was a 2.3 million job growth with each year increasing as well. The net tech employment consists of professional positions in areas such as IT support, network engineering, software development, telecommunications, and other related roles and services that are imperative to the beginning success and development of a startup. Nationally, there was 17.8% increase in job postings for emerging tech startup occupations. And for example, in North Carolina, there was a 20.3% increase in employment opportunities for startups from 2010 to 2019, right before the pandemic hit.
Now I'm going to talk about the main effects of COVID on tech startups. First, venture capital firms are the main source of capital for the tech startup industry. Mark Vardabadian calls it seed financing and says that tech startups have taken the brunt of the hit on the venture capital sector. He also mentions that it has been easier for established firm startups and harder for newcomers. And this is because tech startups tend to engage in high-risk activities from the point of view of an investor. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 44.6% of people in the IT industry have been able to work from home, which is considerably more than the average of most other industries. Although this is true, nearly 9% of people in the IT industry have been unable to work due to the pandemic, which indicates that there's still a fall in employment. It is also worth noting that employees of tech startups generally have at least a bachelor's degree, which means that they are more likely to continue working during the pandemic.
Another thing that was seen with the startups as an effect of COVID was layoffs. So about 70,000 tech startup employees were laid off since the beginning of COVID in March 2020. Tech sector employees consist of AI and other emerging digital tools, and these jobs were cut due to mainly a lack of funding. So as Jeremy was saying earlier, a lot of the funding comes from venture capitalists, but other types of funding is from non-dilutive capital. And a lot of startups have started to turn to that and seek money elsewhere. Some things that consist of non-dilutive capital would be the PPP loans. It's the Paycheck Protection Program. And this is a program where companies can apply for a fully forgiven loan if at least 60% of the amount was used on their payroll. So other sources of non-dilutive capital would be crowdfunding, grants, the revenue-based financing, or even just donations. So in the rise of COVID, PPP loans were harder to receive. And this was mainly because some of the startups were already backed by VC firms, and therefore it made it harder or even impossible for certain startups to receive this adequate funding, and it ultimately led to job loss. Many of the firms that do not already have backed funding or cannot receive the adequate funding, whether it's via venture capitalists or the non-diluted measures, are projected to see and have a decrease in employment, mainly for marketing and sales, and could ultimately result in closure. Some examples of tech startups over the past few years that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic would include Uber, Airbnb, Groupon, and Booking.com, and these are some travel transportation companies, and that was one of the main sectors of tech startups that was hit the hardest.
Okay, now I'm going to discuss the effects of COVID on the supply and demand of labor. As I mentioned before, teleworking or remote working has helped the tech startup industry maintain its supply of labor. And again, large firms are going to bear more of the economic weight as they're more capital intensive, meaning that they're able to increase production more by adding capital as opposed to adding labor. Since the start of the pandemic, there has been an increase in demand for high paid services, and that has led to an increase in demand for high skilled labor. As Victoria mentioned, a lot of the funding, which comes primarily from venture capital firms, is decreasing. And so we notice an overall decrease in demand for labor, which means that the effect from the lack of funding dominates the effect from the increased demand for services. And as we can see on this graph on the right, the overall decrease in the demand for labor will ultimately decrease wages and decrease employment.
So, like many other industries in times of COVID, we are left wondering how tech startups will bounce back in the future. Luckily for tech startups, there are quite a few things happening in this industry's favor. For one, the transition to working remotely has generally been rather seamless. Lockdowns specifically have not had a major impact on tech startups like it has had on other industries. So remote working will not provide any sort of barrier in the future. Along with this, some companies that specialized in online services and things of that nature have actually benefited from this transition to everyone working remotely. And not only this, but it has shifted other companies in this direction as well. Along these same lines, the demand for new and improved services to help with COVID are in higher demand now, which has the potential to lead to even more innovation. So looking at the bigger tech industries like Amazon, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, these companies have actually seen pretty substantial increases in employment during the pandemic, which provides a source of optimism for small tech startups having a bright future down the road. However, unlike these tech giants, the major problem that startups are having is money. So as mentioned before, many tech startups are funded by investors, and many of these investors have simply stopped putting funding toward these startups because of the pandemic. Some startups were lucky and they received PPP loans, like I mentioned before. So in general, for the startups in good financial standing that may have received a loan or found another source of funding, there seems to be hope for the future. But if the startup is really young and hasn't fully got off the ground yet and are really struggling financially, then there could be trouble. So I would say that if a tech startup can just get past this financial barrier, then the future will be bright for them.
Like Mark mentioned, the uncertain nature of the pandemic has made investors risk averse, and many startups are struggling to obtain outside funding. The pandemic has forced startups to be more frugal with their budgets, and many have sought to do so by furloughing employees or letting them go. Professionals who work in the industry are worried about losing their jobs, and many fear that once their furlough period is over, they will be let go. Bloomberg stated that by May 2020, around 40,000 jobs were cut in the tech industry, specifically in those that dealt with travel and retail. Since the pandemic, there has been an increased focus on IT services since everyone has moved to remotely working, which has led to a time crunch, which has led to a crunch time for professionals in the field. But even then, that does not translate to more hiring, as most of the new jobs are limited to fields such as data science, cloud-based services, and artificial intelligence, thereby highlighting the pre-existing skill gap in the tech industry.
All right, and these are our citations. Thanks for watching.